Biden, when he shot off his mouth about why we needed the U.S. Patriots Act, and I went back on the radio and said, Senator Biden, let me talk about plagiarism and how you plagiarize speeches because you weren't smart enough to create your own speech. By the way, thinking of Biden, this is the only man I've ever met, or haven't met, who I've heard of, who talked about Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, giving a speech on the Depression on television in 1929. Now, this is a senator who's been there, 36-odd years in the Senate, didn't know that Franklin Roosevelt wasn't around in 1929, and didn't know we didn't have TV. So this is the level of competency we're talking about in this administration, and in former administrations. So my point is, the rubric that the government will place on you as the protester has to be turned away, discarded, and you have to define your own protest the way you want. Not the way I want, not the way Steve wants, but the way you, the American citizen, wants to define it. If you want to call yourself the Tea Party, fine. You want to call yourself American Citizen Party, that's fine. But at least stand up for your rights. If you don't do it today, what Steve and I are saying, you will rue the day that you never stood up for your own rights and what belongs to you. And what belongs to you is the right to be free. What belongs to you is the right to have happiness and to have the way of life that you've chosen and not the government. What belongs to you is the right to have some sense of privacy, to have your own privacy, and to have some sense of safety. And if the government can no longer provide any of that, the constitutional rights, then the government no longer has legitimacy. And that's what we're talking about. The government no longer has legitimacy. If it instills itself or empowers itself with attributes that do not exist, and it says it's a democracy when it isn't a democracy, when it says that it represents the will of the people when it may not represent the will of the people, as it does not, then the people have the right to protest and say the social contract between the peoples of the United States, I said peoples, that means the different people and entities that exist within the United States, and the entity called the government no longer is viable. And that social contract can be broken. Because we have given the government the right to be able to provide for us, not to rule us, but to provide for us in the way we see fit. Not more, not less. But instead we have created a monster that is out of control, a Frankenstein that is now out of control and is basically in what we call the blowback period, coming back to destroy the very people who created it. And that's the problem we have today. We had yesterday with Bush Jr., and we had the day before with Clinton. So it's up to you, Mr. and Mrs. America. There's really nothing more Steve and I can say. Whether we're arrested after the show or something happens, I don't know. I mean, I've got to be very frank. We really don't know. I've already been brought up on charges of treason. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm brought up on charges of treason again. Because the government has very few choices once it suppresses the will of the people. It has to either suppress more, but it can't suppress less. And in order to suppress more, it has to control more and make sure it has more money and more military capability and more security. Not more health programs, not more education, not more jobs, but more elements that allow it to be more powerful. And if that's the case, then you, the American public, have to say it's enough. I've had enough. I'm tired of it.
Well, I got to tell you, I believe, Steve, based on the emails I'm getting in. Here, let me read a couple because,
Sure.
We don't take call-ins to Steve. When these guys, government officials, come to my house to force my children to take their pandemic vaccinations poison, that's the flashpoint for me and all the other Joe Sixpacks in the country. It will get very ugly. Here's another one. This is from a listener, longtime listener. Guy has worked for our government during the Cold War to keep us safe. He says, my flashpoint is flu shots and closing the banks, changing our currency and martial law. Any one of those started. And all those things are being talked about right now openly. When Hank Paulson, Steve, this is the thing that made me crazy. Not one of those mindless birds in the Senate or in Congress said, Mr. Paulson, where is it stated in our Constitution that you have the right to declare martial law? When he was speaking before the Senate saying if they did not pass the bailout bill in October, that they would declare martial law, where does it say that, Steve, in the Constitution? It doesn't, okay? So that was the thing, too. By the way, all you have to do is watch where the money goes, and it will tell you whose hand is in play, And when you understand whose hand in play, you go and read the books they've written, and they ultimately will bring you to the very same point. You know, in Cold War, I mean, the Russian generals, there were guys like, I used to monitor everything Yuri Andropov said. I don't speak Russian, you do. But, you know, I learned one thing. Andropov, you know, was a pretty good spy master, and second of all, you could begin to see patterns when they spoke and they did what they say they would do, and they did exactly how they said they would do it. I'm not talking about propaganda and stuff. I'm not talking about both, but I'm just
the Russians are very true to their word. If they say they're going to do something, they're going to do it.
And I followed that, the same thing. You know, I remember having a Russian spy master tell me, you believe in technology. We believe in superior forces. He said, you can have 5 missiles with the highest technology. We will have 5,000 missiles. He said, you may take out with your technology 3,000, 4,000 of our missiles. He said, but at the end, we have 1,000 missiles that can still hit you. You know, hey, superior, you know that.
Now what's happened is, during the Cold War, we had some of the best and the brightest who were involved in our national security. Unfortunately now, maybe because in part we don't have a mandatory service to the United States. I'm a great believer that everybody should give up about 2 years of their life in one way or another to serve our country if our country deserves that service. In other words, I wasn't for the wars in Vietnam. I'm not for most wars, but nevertheless, I serve in our military to do the best I can, given the limits and constraints. But we don't have that sense of national service, Steve. And you see it in the young kids. You know, they'd rather go off into the mountains. They'd rather ride their bikes and ski, and they really don't care about this country. You know how many times I've heard here in Montana, "The hell with America"?
Oh, yeah.
It shocked me. And so, if we don't have that, and then you said it so eloquently, where you said, we don't have a history. Most Americans do not understand their history. They do not understand that we were born and bred of a revolution. It is so clear in New Hampshire, live free or die. Don't tread on me. That's their motto. That snake that comes out. We don't have that. We don't understand what it means to 13 colonies. We don't understand what we had to fight for in order to have our liberties. What it cost us. How we were the entrepreneurs of the world. We weren't always good. We didn't suddenly go into the Middle East, for example, historically, in 1956. We've been in the Middle East since 1776. Do most Americans know that? We've had missionaries in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine or Israel now since 1776. We don't know anything about our own history.
Absolutely.
So what then can we legitimately expect from the American public? If they do not know their history, if they do not serve their country, then why should they protest?
Well, because I guess at this point, and like one of my emailers just sent an email, and he said it eloquently. I think he said, he said that millions of people are being prepared intellectually. They're being given the information, that they're drawing the line in the sand. And when people know that there's a vaccine out there and I'm telling you, this is a big deal, Steve, a huge deal.
I know, I can hear it.
Yeah, when they're saying that's when I'm going to fight to the death, and one of my friends said this: I'm not going to waste myself early on civil protest, which will no longer work like the 60s. I'm keeping my firearms ready, my food, medical preps at hand for the right time. And I got to tell you, you've asked me, what will it take? That day is coming. We're out of time, Steve. Thank you. Thank you so much. I
really appreciate you having me as a guest. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. America, for listening, and I hope we can come back and talk to you again.
Okie doke, sir. Thank you. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning into the Q-Files.